They were delivering recently manufactured goods to forward combat units as routine operations. Hartmann's men immediately began transferring fuel to their vehicles. Panzer Grenadiers broke into food supplies, stuffing pockets with chocolate and cigarettes. The looting was not from lack of discipline, but from genuine need. These German soldiers had been advancing for days on reduced rations, their fuel gauges at critical levels, and their vehicles desperately requiring maintenance supplies that German logistics could no longer provide. At 07:20, Hartmann radioed his findings to Kampf Group of Piper headquarters. The response came within minutes. Secure the depot, transfer the maximum possible fuel and supplies, and prepare to transport captured material to rear areas. Similar orders were issued across the Ardennes as German units encountered American supply infrastructure. As German forces continued discovering American supply depots throughout the Ardennes offensive, a pattern emerged that military analysts would study for decades. The captures were not isolated incidents, but systematic revelations of the industrial chasm separating the two militaries. Hauptmann Werner Sternberg, supply officer for the 12th SS Panzer Division, compiled detailed reports of captured American material during the offensive's first week. His documentation, recovered from German military archives in the 1970s, provided statistical analysis revealing the shocking disparity between German and American logistics systems. Between December 16th and December 23rd, 1944, German forces in the Ardennes captured or discovered 47 American supply depots of varying sizes. Sternberg's analysis categorized these into three types: forward supply points like the one Hartmann discovered, battalion-level depots supporting 500 to 800 men, and larger regimental supply bases. Even the smallest forward points contained more material than comparable German facilities. The fuel discovery shocked German quartermasters most profoundly. Total captured American gasoline exceeded 2.88 million liters. According to Sternberg's calculations, this quantity represented more fuel than the entire 6th Panzer Army had been allocated for the offensive's first week. American forces had apparently abandoned more fuel in their retreat than Germany had assembled for its largest Western offensive since 1940. Quantity alone did not tell the whole story. Quality differences revealed even more disturbing truths about comparative industrial capacity. American gasoline bore octane ratings of 80 or higher, suitable for high-performance aircraft engines. German synthetic fuel production, struggling under Allied bombing, was producing gasoline with octane ratings of 87 for aviation use and as low as 74 for ground vehicles. The Wehrmacht had been forced to reduce engine compression ratios in new tank designs because fuel quality could not support high-performance engines. Food supply comparisons revealed equally stark contrasts. American ration specifications documented in captured supply manifest allocated 4,158 calories per soldier per day in combat operations. German rations by December 1944 provided approximately 2,500 calories daily, and actual field conditions often reduced this further. American soldiers were being fed at levels that sustained peak physical performance. German soldiers were slowly starving while fighting. The American K ration, one of several types discovered by German troops, contained canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and chewing gum, weighing approximately 800 grams. German iron rations issued for emergency situations consisted of hard bread and canned meat totaling perhaps 400 grams. American emergency rations exceeded German standard field rations in both quantity and quality. On December 20, 1944, Oberheilemann, commanding the 5th Falcom Jäger Division, ordered a systematic inventory of captured American supplies at a regimental depot his paratroopers had overrun near Wiltz, Luxembourg. The depot had supported elements of the 28th Infantry Division before their withdrawal under German pressure. Hillemann's inventory, recorded in division records, documented 150,000 individual meal rations, enough to feed his entire division for nearly 2 weeks. Medical supplies included 40,000 doses of penicillin, a drug German forces had never successfully manufactured for military use. Cigarettes numbered over 200,000. Along with 50,000 chocolate bars. The depot also contained 3,000 wool blankets, 2,000 pairs of winter boots, and 500 complete winter uniform sets. The most disturbing discovery came from manufacturing documentation. Every supply crate, equipment item, and ammunition box bore stamps indicating production date and location. Heileman's staff analyzed these markings and reached a conclusion that challenged their understanding of warfare. Most supplies had been manufactured between September and November 1944. They had been produced in America, shipped across the Atlantic, moved through European supply networks, and delivered to forward combat units within weeks of manufacture. German war production, by comparison, had collapsed into crisis by late 1944. Albert Speer's production ministry records, examined by historians after the war, documented the catastrophic impact of Allied bombing. German ammunition production had peaked in September 1944 at approximately 1.2 million artillery shells monthly across all calibers. By December, production had fallen to 750,000 shells monthly, a 37% reduction in 3 months. American ammunition production for the same period exceeded 2.5 million artillery shells monthly, according to U.S. War Production Board statistics. American industry was not just outproducing German factories. It was simultaneously supplying multiple theaters across the Pacific and Europe, while German production struggled to maintain single-front operations. The vehicle production comparison revealed perhaps the starkest contrast. In 1944, American industry manufactured approximately 7,500 Sherman tanks. German industry that same year produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,000 Tiger tanks, totaling about 7,000 main battle tanks. The United States was building more than twice as many tanks while also producing thousands of aircraft, ships, and other military equipment at scales Germany could not approach. German soldiers discovering American depots could not access production statistics. They could only see the evidence before them. That evidence told a story of industrial disparity that made German victory mathematically impossible. The supplies they captured represented American routine logistics, not special accumulations or emergency reserves. This was how American forces operated normally. The discoveries in American supply depots triggered a cascade of realizations throughout the German military hierarchy that extended far beyond tactical considerations. What began as opportunistic looting evolved into a profound psychological crisis as German soldiers and officers confronted the impossibility of victory against such industrial supremacy. On December 23, 1944, Oberto Rehr, commanding officer of the Führer Brigade, convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff officers at his headquarters near Bastau. The minutes of the meeting, preserved in captured German records, painted a picture of growing despair and reluctant clarity among officers who had once spoken only of victory. Discussions that would have been labeled defeatist a few weeks earlier now reflected the stark recognition of reality. Colonel Reimer's intelligence officer presented a detailed report on the captured American supply depots encountered throughout the brigade's area of operations. In only 7 days of offensive maneuvers, the brigade had overrun or discovered a dozen American supply points. The amount of captured material was staggering: 380,000 liters of fuel, 45,000 full rations, 12,000 artillery shells, and assorted equipment valued at more than 2 million Reichsmarks. Yet despite these seemingly impressive captures, the brigade's own supply situation remained critical. Vehicles were still running low on fuel, and ammunition stocks were being rationed with painful precision. The contradiction was devastating to morale. The Germans had seized in a single week more material than their own logistical system could have delivered in nearly a month of organized operations. Yet these same supplies had been discarded by retreating American units as if they were inconsequential. What the Germans treated as strategic treasure, the Americans regarded as expendable. This paradox struck at the core of the German soldiers' understanding of the war. The Americans were losing more through tactical withdrawals than the entire German 6th Panzer Army could hope to deliver through its strained supply network. The difference was not one of luck or planning, but of sheer industrial power. Major Heinrich Vogel, Reimer's operations officer, gave voice to the realization that many in the room had silently reached. He said, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial system that treats warfare as a production problem. Every American soldier represents tons of support infrastructure. Every German soldier represents diminishing returns on collapsing capacity. His statement was met with uncomfortable silence, not because anyone disagreed, but because it named an unwelcome truth. For years, German doctrine had rested on the conviction that superior tactics and discipline could overcome numerical inferiority. Since the campaigns of 1939, the Wehrmacht had believed that its speed, coordination, and initiative could offset the material advantage of any enemy. But the discoveries in the Ardennes made it clear that tactical excellence could not compensate for an enemy whose factories could endlessly replace every shell, every truck, and every man lost in combat. General Lieutenant Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff for the 6th Panzer Army, understood this at a systemic level. On December 24, 1944, he compiled a comprehensive analysis of American logistics for Field Marshal Walter Model. The report, later recovered from German archives, remains one of the most complete examinations of Allied supply power written by a German officer during the war. Kramer's calculations showed that the American depots captured in the Ardennes represented only about 4% of the total supply infrastructure supporting U.S. operations in Western Europe. These depots were not central bases, but merely forward distribution points. Behind them, in France, stood massive main depots that held 20 times as much material, constantly replenished by ships arriving from ports across the Atlantic. For Kramer and his peers, the numbers were crushing. If the supplies found in Naketa, small front-line depots could sustain entire German divisions for weeks, and if those depots represented only a tiny fraction of American theater logistics, then Germany was not merely losing a battle of attrition, it was losing a contest of magnitude. The United States had achieved an industrial capacity so vast that comparison itself became meaningless. Germany's losses could not be replaced. America's losses barely registered as fluctuations in a limitless production system. Kramer's report also analyzed the philosophical differences in how the two nations approached logistics. American supply operations functioned on a push system, in which supplies were sent forward continuously, often without specific requests, ensuring that frontline units always had abundance. German logistics, by contrast, operated on a pull system. Units submitted requests that were fulfilled only if materials were available, which often they were not. The American method assumed abundance as a fact of war, while the German system assumed scarcity as its foundation. These differences went far beyond organizational design. They reflected the opposing realities of two nations at war. America could afford to waste. Germany could not afford to fail. By Christmas Eve 1944, this contrast became painfully personal for thousands of German soldiers scattered across the Ardennes forests. Many spent the night eating captured American rations, smoking American cigarettes, and wearing American winter coats taken from depots. In their laughter and relief, there was an undercurrent of humiliation. They survived that night not because of German strength, but because of American abundance. Under Officer Hans Wagner of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division wrote to his wife that evening, "We had Christmas dinner from American supplies today. Real coffee, canned meat, chocolate, and cigarettes. The men were happy for the first time in weeks, but all I could think was that these Americans abandon more food in retreat than we receive in our official rations. How can we defeat an enemy who treats such plenty as ordinary?" Letters like Wagner's, intercepted by Allied intelligence and later recovered from the battlefield, revealed the growing psychological despair within the German ranks. Soldiers who had been taught that endurance and sacrifice were the path to victory now faced an enemy for whom war seemed almost effortless. The abundance of captured supplies stripped meaning from their hardship. Sacrifice, once seen as noble, began to feel pointless. If the enemy could afford to leave behind what Germans considered precious, what hope remained for victory? This realization spread upward through the officer corps. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, sent a confidential memorandum to Field Marshal Model on December 26. The document's tone was cautious, but its conclusions were direct. The captured American supply caches, he wrote, confirmed intelligence assessments about the sheer scale of U.S. industrial power. No amount of tactical brilliance or courage could overcome such disparity. Tactical victories might still be possible in isolated engagements, but true strategic success required equality of resources, and that, Manteuffel admitted, was unattainable. His acknowledgement was striking, even dangerous, for a senior officer under the Nazi regime. It directly contradicted the party's belief that willpower and ideological conviction could replace material strength. Yet for men like Manteuffel, the evidence was undeniable. The war had become a mathematical impossibility. When the Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, the German army had long since recognized its failure. The American supply depots captured during those 6 desperate weeks came to symbolize the deeper truth behind the defeat. They were not merely evidence of local success or failure, they were physical proof of why Germany was losing the war. The mountains of food, fuel, and ammunition abandoned by retreating Americans represented only the routine operations of a vast logistical empire. For Germany, each of those items was a lifeline that could no longer be produced at home. In the end, the statistics were merciless. German casualties in the Ardennes totaled about 67,000 dead, 100,000 wounded, and over 30,000 captured. Equipment losses included roughly 800 tanks and assault guns, 1,000 aircraft, and thousands of trucks and support vehicles. But the true loss went deeper than numbers. The discovery of American supply depots forced the German military to confront a truth it had long avoided, that modern war was no longer won by courage, leadership, or tactical genius alone. It was won by industry, by the capacity to build faster, transport farther, and replace endlessly. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, as soldiers warmed their hands over fires fueled by American gasoline, the German army realized that no amount of bravery could bridge the gulf between a starving nation and an industrial giant that treated abundance as routine. Germany's losses during the winter of 1944-1945 were catastrophic and irreplaceable, coming at a time when its industrial capacity was collapsing under constant Allied bombardment and its fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Factories lay in ruins, rail networks were crippled, and the once proud industrial heartland of the Reich could no longer sustain even minimal wartime output. The German army, already weakened by years of attrition, found itself fighting not only against Allied armies, but against the arithmetic of production itself. Every tank destroyed, every aircraft lost, every fuel depot bombed represented a blow that could no longer be repaired. American forces, meanwhile, suffered severe casualties during the Battle of the Bulge. About 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured. But unlike the Germans, the United States possessed the industrial depth to absorb such losses with little disruption. Replacement divisions, vehicles, weapons, and supplies poured into Europe from American factories at a rate that astonished even Allied commanders. Within weeks, U.S. units that had been mauled in the Ardennes were fully re-equipped and ready for renewed offensives. This industrial resilience reflected not only material superiority, but also an immense logistical organization that could deliver supplies and reinforcements across oceans and continents without pause. In January 1945, the German commander in the West submitted a candid assessment of the failed offensive to OKW headquarters. His report, captured after the war, provided a rare glimpse of realism within a command structure increasingly divorced from reality. He admitted that the Ardennes operation had revealed a truth that could no longer be denied. The German army faced an opponent whose industrial resources rendered traditional military resistance hopeless. No matter how well German units fought tactically, no amount of skill could compensate for the vast imbalance in production. The report declared that victory was possible only if Germany achieved industrial parity, or if internal political turmoil weakened the enemy from within, neither of which appeared remotely achievable. In essence, he was admitting that continued fighting was militarily futile, even though political loyalty to Hitler's regime made surrender unthinkable. The data gathered by German intelligence in early 1945 attempted to quantify this disparity, though even their figures could not fully capture its enormity. American steel production outpaced Germany's by a factor of 3, aluminum by 5, military vehicles by 4, and aircraft by 3. Yet these numbers, stark as they were, failed to express the true magnitude of American superiority. The United States was simultaneously supplying the Western Front, the Pacific Theater, and numerous allied nations, while Germany struggled merely to sustain one collapsing front. The most devastating gap lay in petroleum production. In 1944, American refineries produced over 5 million barrels of oil per day. Germany, reliant on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into crude substitutes, never exceeded 180,000 barrels daily, and by early 1945, Allied bombers had reduced that to a mere 50,000 barrels. The result was a ratio approaching 100 to 1 in favor of the United States. To the Germans, the realization was staggering. The fuel stored in a single captured American supply depot represented more petroleum than the entire Reich could produce in a month. Captured after the war, numerous German officers testified that these discoveries changed their understanding of the conflict. One general admitted during interrogation that when he heard German troops had captured enormous American supply dumps, yet still failed for lack of fuel and transport, he knew the war was irretrievably lost. If seizing the enemy's supplies could not solve the crisis, nothing could. The problem was not courage, strategy, or leadership. It was mathematics. American factories, powered by a vast and secure economy, produced war materiel on a scale that made German victory impossible, regardless of battlefield heroics. This revelation filtered down to the front lines. Letters and diaries from ordinary soldiers show how the captured depots shattered morale rather than strengthening it. Men who had long believed Nazi propaganda about Germany's technical and industrial superiority found themselves surrounded by evidence of the opposite. Piles of food, fuel, cigarettes, and medical supplies, luxuries by German standards, had been left behind by retreating Americans who seemed not to care about such abundance. One infantryman wrote that when he saw the captured stockpiles, it felt like discovering treasure. But then he realized that the Americans had simply abandoned these supplies and kept fighting as if nothing had happened. That, he wrote, was when he understood Germany could never win. How could a nation triumph over an enemy that regarded what was for them treasure as merely expendable? By February 1945, German strategy had shifted from seeking victory to delaying collapse. Planning staffs knew that American logistics were effectively invincible. The U.S. Army could sustain continuous offensives regardless of German counterattacks or supply disruptions. Attempts to interdict American supply lines were futile. Every destroyed convoy was replaced almost instantly. The only course remaining to the German command was to inflict as many casualties as possible, hoping political pressure at home might force the Allies to negotiate. But this was a desperate illusion. Militarily, Germany's defeat was already sealed. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and pushed into the German heartland, the situation became tragically symbolic. German units now found American supply depots established on their own soil. These depots, brimming with material abundance, stood in stark contrast to the deprivation of the German population. Civilians who saw these stockpiles began to grasp what the soldiers had already learned. The war was unwinnable. The reality of America's industrial strength shattered years of propaganda about the invincibility of German engineering and production. It was not superior tactics or morale that decided the war, it was industry, scale, and logistics. The final reckoning of the Ardennes offensive confirmed this truth. Germany had poured its last reserves into an operation that yielded temporary tactical gains but no lasting advantage. The losses in men, vehicles, and fuel were crippling. Meanwhile, American industry replaced every loss and continued its advance without interruption. The logic of arithmetic had triumphed over ideology. A nation that produced nearly a third of the world's industrial output had defeated a nation that produced barely a tenth. No amount of battlefield brilliance could alter that equation. After the war, historians from both sides recognized the discovery of the American supply depots as a pivotal psychological and strategic moment in the collapse of the German army. Before the Ardennes, many soldiers could still cling to the belief that superior tactics or discipline might somehow reverse the tide. Afterward, those illusions vanished. The overwhelming material superiority of the Allies had been laid bare, undeniable and absolute. Even the most devoted officers could no longer ignore the truth. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that German defeat was fundamentally industrial rather than tactical. Once Allied bombing had reduced production below the minimum required to sustain operations, no amount of skill or bravery could avert collapse. The captured depots in the Ardennes offered concrete proof of this imbalance. Mountains of supplies, fuel, and ammunition that demonstrated how modern war was now a contest of production rather than maneuver. This transformation marked a turning point in the nature of warfare itself. In the industrial age, the ability to produce, transport, and replace materiel had become more decisive than battlefield genius or soldierly valor. Germany's army remained tactically superb, but its factories could no longer equip it to fight a modern, mechanized war against a power that could outproduce it 100-fold. Today, the sites where German troops discovered those American depots still exist, quiet among the forests of the Ardennes. Small plaques and memorials mark them, commemorating not only the battles, but the moment when thousands of soldiers realized that courage and discipline could not overcome economic reality. The sound of gunfire and engines has long faded, replaced by silence and birdsong. Yet the ground still bears witness to that revelation, the point where the myth of German invincibility gave way to the cold truth of industrial disparity. These places remind us that in the 20th century, war was no longer decided solely by strategy or spirit, but by the capacity of nations to build, supply, and sustain.